Human led the injured alien girl through a whiteout storm, but her mother blamed him for surviving. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Ethan Miller wasn't used to this kind of weather. He had been stationed on distant planets before, but nothing compared to the storm raging around him. The whiteout was brutal, a wall of snow and wind that swallowed everything whole. The air was sharp, biting at his exposed skin as he trudged through the snow. He had to keep moving. He had no choice. The young alien girl in his arms, Alia, was badly injured. Her leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and she was barely conscious, her breathing shallow, her body trembling from the cold. Ethan's mind raced. The storm was getting worse. He could barely see more than a few feet in front of him, and the howling wind made it hard to hear anything beyond the rush of snow. He had to find shelter, and fast. Every step he took felt like an eternity, but he pushed on. He wasn't going to let her die out here. Alia had been part of the group of explorers that had crashed on this frozen planet. Ethan wasn't sure exactly what happened, something about hostile forces, or maybe just bad luck, but Alia had been left behind, separated from the others. The rest of the team was somewhere out there, but Ethan knew they wouldn't last long in these conditions. No one could. He had to focus. He couldn't let the cold creep into his bones. Not yet. He stumbled forward, his eyes squinting against the snow and wind. Then, finally, he saw it. A cave. A dark opening in the side of a rock formation, barely visible through the swirling storm. He surged forward, his legs aching with each step. He could feel Alia's slight weight in his arms, and he knew he had to keep moving. When he finally reached the cave, he collapsed. Inside, his breath ragged from exhaustion. He gently lowered Alia to the ground, her body limp in his arms. The cave wasn't much, just a small, jagged shelter from the storm. But it was enough. He could hear her shallow breaths and he quickly wrapped her in what remained of his emergency supplies. His mind was still racing, his thoughts muddled with the storm and the urgency of survival. But for now, they were safe. For now, they were alive. Ethan sat beside her, his back against the cave wall, his eyes never leaving her. He kept checking her pulse, adjusting her makeshift blanket, trying to warm her as best he could. He had no medical training, no way of knowing if she would survive the night. But he couldn't give up on her. Not when he had come this far. As the hours passed, the storm raged outside, and Alia's condition seemed to stabilize. Ethan's heart beat faster with each passing minute. He couldn't afford to relax, not yet. Then, just as he thought he might be able to breathe, he heard footsteps approaching the entrance of the cave. His heart skipped a beat. Who was out there? He stood up quickly, his hand reaching for his weapon, ready to defend them both. But as the figure stepped inside, Ethan lowered his weapon, his breath catching in his throat. Standing in the doorway was Alia's mother, a tall, imposing figure with pale blue skin and eyes like ice. She was drenched from the storm, her expression one of fierce anger. Her gaze locked onto Ethan, and for a moment, there was silence. "You," she said, her voice sharp and cold. "You did this. You let her survive." Ethan didn't know what to say. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had saved her daughter. He had done everything he could. But in the eyes of this alien mother, it wasn't enough. He couldn't win. Not now. Not with her standing there, full of fury. The coldness in her eyes was like a blade, and he knew there was nothing he could do to change her mind. The storm outside may have ended, but for Ethan, the real battle was just beginning. The air inside the cave felt colder now. Ethan sat motionless, his back against the rock wall, watching as Alia's mother stood at the entrance. Her presence was overpowering, like the storm itself had taken form and entered the cave. The woman's cold blue eyes never left Ethan's face, her gaze sharp, calculating, as though she was trying to figure him out, or worse, trying to judge him. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He had done everything he could. He had fought against the storm, led her daughter to safety, and kept her alive. But in the face of this alien mother's fury, it all felt insignificant. Alia's mother stepped into the cave, her voice steady but filled with an icy rage. "You think you can save her?" she asked. Her tone was filled with contempt. "You humans always believe you can fix things, make things better, but you can't." Ethan felt the weight of her words. She wasn't just angry, she was broken, desperate in her own way. He could see that now, the way she looked at her daughter, and the way she looked at him. He was a stranger, someone from another world. Someone who wasn't supposed to be here. "I did everything I could," Ethan said, his voice low. "I carried her. I kept her alive. She's here because of me." Alia's mother didn't flinch. "And what do you think that means? You think that makes you a hero?" She paused, her eyes narrowing. "You don't understand. You don't know what it's like. To watch someone you love fall apart, to be broken, and to see them suffer." Ethan could feel the tension in the air thickening, like the storm still raged inside the cave. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, but his words felt hollow, useless. "I'm just trying to help her." Alia's mother stepped closer, her presence almost overwhelming. "You think you're the one who's going to save her? You're nothing but a human, an outsider." She looked down at Alia, her daughter still unconscious, wrapped in the makeshift blankets Ethan had managed to fashion. Her gaze softened for a split second, and in that moment, Ethan saw something other than rage. He saw pain. He saw fear. Alia's mother looked back at him, her voice now quieter, but still firm. "You humans don't understand our ways. You think you can come here, save us, and leave. But you can't. You won't. Not with her." Ethan was taken aback by the sudden shift in her tone. For a moment, he wasn't sure if she was talking to him or herself. He stood up, moving slowly toward Alia, as if trying to bridge the gap between them. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Do you want me to leave? Is that what you want?" The alien mother didn't answer right away. She stepped forward, kneeling beside her daughter. The anger had gone, replaced by something far more vulnerable. "I want her to live," she whispered. "I want her to have a chance. And you've given her that. But I can't forgive you for it. Not yet. Not with what happened. Not with her still." She trailed off, the words stuck in her throat, the weight of everything pressing down on her. Ethan took a deep breath. He had expected anger, but not this. Not this silence, this brokenness. It was more than just a mother's rage, it was a loss so deep that even survival felt like a betrayal. He knelt beside them, not knowing what else to do. The storm outside had finally started to settle, but in the cave, the silence lingered, as though time itself had frozen. He had tried to save Alia. But now, in the face of her mother's sorrow, Ethan wasn't sure if that was enough. The silence in the cave stretched on, thick and heavy, the tension between Ethan and Alia's mother palpable in the dim light. Ethan could feel the weight of her words, the pain behind them, and for a moment, he wasn't sure what to say or how to make things right. He had saved her daughter's life, but in doing so, he had made a choice that this alien mother couldn't accept. He stood up, stepping back to give her space, but the silence that followed felt like a chasm between them, one that neither of them knew how to cross. Alia's mother remained kneeling beside her daughter, her face still a mask of grief. She hadn't looked at Ethan since he spoke, her focus entirely on her child. Ethan didn't know what he had expected, but this was harder than anything he'd faced in battle. The human mind could only understand so much, but the bond between mother and child, alien or human, was something beyond logic. "You're angry," Ethan said softly, his voice breaking the silence. "I get it. But I had no choice. She wouldn't have made it without me." The words felt weak, even to him. They didn't convey the urgency, the desperation, the rawness of the moments he had spent dragging Alia through the storm. He had done what he had to do. But now, standing here in the cave, facing a woman who couldn't see that, it felt like nothing he could say would ever be enough. Alia's mother finally looked up at him, her eyes colder than the storm outside. She didn't speak at first, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze, something softer than the anger, a trace of vulnerability, as though she was fighting a war inside her own mind. You think saving her life means everything is forgiven? Her voice was quiet, but there was a bite to it. Ethan could hear the pain in her words, the years of struggle, of loss, and of a life lived on the edge of survival. He didn't know what it was like for her, to have everything she loved ripped away in an instant, but in that moment, he realized just how much she had already lost. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Ethan replied, his voice low. I'm asking for understanding. I didn't save her just to be a hero. I saved her because she needed it. Because we both needed it. Alia's mother stared at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face, as though trying to find something real, something honest in his words. For a moment, Ethan wondered if she would say anything more, but the silence returned, this time more oppressive than ever. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the silence was broken again, not by words, but by the soft sound of Alia stirring. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward her. Her eyes fluttered open, her gaze foggy at first, as though the world around her was still a blur. But then she focused, and her eyes landed on her mother, and a small, weak smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Alia's voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but the words hit Ethan harder than any of the storms they had weathered. I'm sorry, she murmured, her voice shaky. I didn't mean to be a burden. Alia's mother's eyes softened instantly, her anger melting away like snow in the spring sun. She reached out, her hands trembling as she cupped Alia's face gently. You're not a burden, she whispered, the words filled with more love than Ethan had ever imagined. It was then that Ethan understood. This wasn't about survival. It wasn't about saving lives or proving anything. It was about something deeper, something that went beyond him, beyond the storm. The love between a mother and her child could never be broken. And in that moment, Ethan knew he had done the right thing. But he also knew that there would be no easy path forward, not for him, not for Alia, and certainly not for her mother. The storm outside had passed, but their journey was far from over. The warmth of the cave was a welcome relief from the harsh storm outside. Ethan had spent the last few hours quietly observing the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Alia was still unconscious, her breathing slow but steady. Her mother, on the other hand, had remained silent, her gaze never straying far from her daughter. The emotional weight in the air was undeniable, but as time passed, something seemed to ease. Alia's mother, who had once been so cold toward Ethan, was now focused entirely on her daughter, her earlier anger subdued into a quiet determination. Ethan understood the gravity of the situation. He had done what he could, but this was far from over. The storm outside might have passed, but the emotional storm inside the cave was still raging. He couldn't help but wonder if he'd done the right thing. Was it enough to save Alia? Or was he simply prolonging the inevitable? She'll make it, he muttered under his breath, more to reassure himself than anything else. But deep down, he knew that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about what came next. What would Alia's mother think of him now? What would Alia think when she woke up? He couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt weighing on his chest. A few hours ago, he had been just a soldier doing his job. But now, in this cave with a wounded alien girl and her grieving mother, he felt like a man caught in a situation he didn't fully understand. The alien world was so different from his own. Their customs, their culture, their emotions. They were all foreign to him, and yet here he was, trying to navigate a world he had no place in. He wasn't prepared for this. He wasn't prepared to be the one who kept someone alive, to be the one who had to shoulder the responsibility of their survival. But here he was. He glanced over at Alia's mother again. She was still silent, but there was something softer in her eyes now. She wasn't looking at him with anger anymore. Instead, she looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something he couldn't quite place. Was it acceptance? Maybe. But more likely, it was the beginning of understanding. She wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, she could see that he wasn't her enemy. That was all he could hope for right now. He didn't expect a warm embrace, or a thank you. But he could hope that they wouldn't be at odds forever. The hours dragged on. The fire flickered low, casting long shadows across the cave walls. Ethan sat on a nearby rock, his back resting against the cold stone. He tried to relax, but his mind kept racing. The howling wind outside had subsided, but the silence in the cave was deafening. Suddenly, Alia stirred again. Ethan immediately straightened up, his eyes locked on her. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for a brief moment, she seemed confused, disoriented. Her mother was immediately at her side, her hand gently brushing her hair back. "Alia," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You're safe now." Alia's eyes slowly focused, and she turned her head toward her mother. A weak smile crossed her face, but it was clear she was still struggling to grasp what had happened. I remember the storm," she said, her voice hoarse. "I thought," she paused, taking a shallow breath. "I thought I was going to die." Alia's mother's face softened, and she took her daughter's hand in both of hers. "You're alive, child," she said quietly. "And that's all that matters." Alia turned her gaze to Ethan, her eyes searching his face. She looked at him for a long time, and for a moment, he wasn't sure what she was thinking. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you," she said. It was a simple phrase, but in that moment, it carried so much. "Wait." Ethan nodded, unsure of what else to say. His heart swelled with a mixture of relief and something else, something that made him feel like he had done something more than just survive. He had helped them both survive. And that was enough for now. The storm had passed, both outside and within the cave. And although their journey was far from over, Ethan couldn't help but feel that, for the first time in what felt like forever, they were going to be okay. The days that followed were quiet, but far from easy. The storm had passed, but the harsh environment outside remained unforgiving. Ethan kept watch over Alia and her mother, though their dynamic had changed. The tension between him and Alia's mother, while still present, had softened. The silence between them was now a familiar companion, and Ethan found himself respecting it. He didn't expect gratitude, but the small moments of understanding from Alia's mother were enough to make him believe they might eventually find some kind of peace. Alia, on the other hand, was recovering faster than Ethan had expected. Her wounds were healing, and though she still moved carefully, she seemed stronger with each passing day. She spent most of her time resting, but Ethan noticed her eyes always followed her mother, and there was a quiet sadness in her gaze that never fully left. Ethan wasn't sure what had happened before the storm, but he could guess that there had been more to their journey than just a simple crash. He could see it in their eyes, the shared history, the unspoken burdens. Alia's mother had said little, but her actions spoke volumes. She would help her daughter when needed, but she always kept her distance from Ethan, as if something still held her back. Days blended into one another, and before long, the cave that had once felt like a refuge began to feel like a prison. Ethan knew they couldn't stay there forever. The cold, isolated world outside would always be there, but eventually, they had to move forward. One evening, after the sun had set and the stars began to dot the sky, Alia's mother stood up and walked to the entrance of the cave. Ethan, who had been quietly organizing their supplies, looked up at her. She was staring out into the vast, empty landscape, the wind still howling in the distance. He hesitated, unsure of whether to approach or not. After a moment, he decided to join her. He stood up, brushing the dust from his hands, and walked toward her. "We can't stay here," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight he hadn't realized he'd been holding. She didn't turn to face him, but he could feel the tension in the air. "I know," she replied, her voice softer than usual. "But where will we go?" Ethan stood beside her, looking out into the endless expanse. He had no answer. He had never been good with plans, especially when they involved alien worlds. "We have to find shelter, a place where we can stay safe until help arrives," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. She nodded, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "Help," she murmured, almost to herself. There's no help coming. You've done what you could. We're on our own now. Her words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He had always believed that help would come eventually. That someone would find them, that this world was just another obstacle to overcome. But in her voice, he heard the finality of someone who had lost faith. It was a sobering thought. Ethan glanced back at Alia, who was resting by the fire, her face peaceful in sleep. "We'll find a way," he said, his voice firm. "We have to." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes steady and cold. "Do you really believe that?" she asked. Ethan opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. Did he really believe that? Did he believe in the promise of hope when everything around him said otherwise? He wasn't sure. But as he stood there, looking at her, at the woman who had just lost everything, he realized something. They had to keep moving. They had to keep fighting. Because without that, they would have nothing left. The wind picked up again, swirling around them like a reminder of the world outside. The storm might have passed, but the journey ahead was still unclear. Together, they would have to face whatever came next. And for the first time in days, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. It was small, but it was enough. The following days were filled with small, quiet movements. The storm had subsided, but the threat of the elements was still present. The planet's harsh environment was nothing to be underestimated. Ethan knew they couldn't afford to stay in the cave for much longer. Their food and supplies were dwindling, and although Alia had regained some strength, her mother remained distant. She had yet to fully accept Ethan's presence, but he sensed the slow shift. There was no immediate hostility in her eyes anymore, but neither was there trust. She simply watched him, as though she were waiting for something, waiting to see if he would prove worthy of whatever faith they still had left. Alia, on the other hand, had become more active. She no longer needed help moving, though she still limped when walking, the pain from her leg injury lingering. Ethan made sure to check on her every day, offering her food and water, but mostly, he stayed out of her way. There was something about her that made him uneasy, not because of her condition, but because of the way she looked at him sometimes. It was a mix of gratitude and something else, an unspoken tension that neither of them acknowledged. One morning, Ethan woke early. He had been unable to sleep the night before, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. The cold was biting, but the sky was clear. The sun had just risen, casting its pale light over the rocky terrain. It was an opportunity. They could leave the cave, find a place to settle for the time being, and maybe even find some other survivors. It was a long shot, but it was their best chance. Ethan gathered what little gear they had left, ensuring everything was packed tightly. The decision was made. They would leave today. He walked over to Alia's mother, who was sitting by the fire, her eyes distant as she stared at the flames. He had learned not to approach her too abruptly, she didn't take well to sudden movements. "We should leave," he said quietly, standing just a few feet away. She didn't respond immediately, only shifted slightly, her attention still on the fire. It wasn't until Ethan took a step closer that she spoke. "Where would we go?" Her voice was softer than before, but still guarded. Ethan hesitated. "We can't stay here. We need to find shelter, something more secure. We can't keep living in isolation." She finally turned her head toward him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied his face. He could see the conflict in her expression, the hesitation. "And you think I'll just follow you?" she asked. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything. You think you can fix things just by moving forward, by pretending it's enough." Her words stung, but he didn't flinch. "I'm not pretending. I know we've lost a lot. But if we don't move, we'll lose everything else too." The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Alia's mother stood up, brushing the dirt from her clothing. "We leave at first light tomorrow. But we do it my way." Ethan didn't argue. He had no choice but to accept her decision. They weren't allies yet, but they were surviving together. That was all that mattered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft glow over the desolate landscape. Ethan sat by the fire, lost in thought. He had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure: whatever came next, they had to face it together. They were stronger now, survivors, not just strangers who happened to be stuck in the same place. Ethan glanced over at Alia, who had settled by the fire, her eyes closed in quiet reflection. For the first time in days, she looked peaceful. And as the stars began to twinkle overhead, he allowed himself to believe that, just maybe, they would make it out of this alive. The next morning, the air was crisp, a sharp contrast to the cold, suffocating silence of the cave. Ethan had barely slept, his mind racing with the uncertainty of the journey ahead. Alia and her mother had already packed the few belongings they had, ready to leave. It was clear that Alia's mother wasn't thrilled with the idea of moving, but she knew they had no other choice. The cold, the isolation, the threat of the unknown, they couldn't remain in that cave forever. Alia seemed stronger, though her limp was still noticeable as she walked, but she held herself with more confidence now, perhaps a little more hopeful. Ethan kept his distance, knowing his presence was still a delicate subject for both of them. He had to earn their trust, piece by piece. Alia's mother, however, remained more withdrawn, her movements measured and cautious. She wasn't openly hostile, but there was an unmistakable wariness in the way she observed him, as if she were still waiting for him to prove himself. Ethan had learned not to push too hard. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, getting them to safety. They set out at dawn, the wind picking up as they made their way across the barren landscape. The planet's terrain was rugged, with jagged rocks and deep crevices that made every step an effort. But Ethan was determined. He didn't know how long the journey would take, but he couldn't afford to waste time. They needed shelter, and they needed it fast. The first few hours passed in relative silence. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the snow and the occasional wind gust, howling through the rocky expanse. Ethan kept an eye on Alia, making sure she wasn't too exhausted from the strain on her body. She had insisted on walking despite her injury, but he could tell she was pushing herself. Her mother, though quiet, kept a protective watch over her daughter, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Ethan didn't know how long they could keep up the pace, but they couldn't afford to stop for too long. The weather, though better than the storm, still had a biting cold to it. As they trekked through the snow, Ethan found himself thinking about how strange it all was, how they had gone from being complete strangers to relying on each other for survival. He couldn't help but feel a connection, a bond forming between them, even if it was still fragile. Hours later, they came across a small outcropping of rock that provided some shelter from the wind. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a short break. Alia sat down first, clearly relieved to take the weight off her injured leg. Her mother immediately began checking their supplies, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Ethan stood watch, scanning the area for any signs of danger. As the minutes passed, he couldn't help but feel the tension in the air between them. Alia's mother had said little during the journey, but now that they had stopped, Ethan noticed her glancing at him more often, her eyes softening, though still cautious. It was as if she was reconsidering him, as if the walls she had put up were beginning to crumble, piece by piece. He could only hope that, in time, they would see him as more than just a stranger, more than just the human who had helped her daughter survive the storm. But for now, all he could do was wait and keep moving forward. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: they were no longer just survivors in a harsh world. They were a small, fragile group, bound together by necessity. And perhaps, in time, they would become more than that. The rest stop was brief, but it was enough for the group to gather their strength before continuing their journey. Alia's leg was still bothering her, though the pain seemed to be less intense. Ethan kept an eye on her, making sure she wasn't pushing herself too hard. Her mother, however, seemed unbothered by the fatigue, moving with a quiet determination as if she had been walking across harsh landscapes all her life. They continued their journey for several more hours, navigating through the rugged terrain. Ethan could feel the weight of their silence, but it wasn't the same as before. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, even if no words had been exchanged. Alia, walking a little slower now, kept glancing at Ethan, her eyes not as guarded as they had been when they first met. Ethan knew she wasn't fully trusting him yet, but the small signs of change were enough to give him hope. As the sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow over the distant mountains, the group reached a sheltered valley. The terrain here was less harsh, with large boulders providing cover from the wind. It wasn't much, but it was a good place to make camp for the night. Ethan immediately set to work, gathering what little firewood they had left. Alia's mother helped, but her movements were slow, as if she were lost in thought. Alia, on the other hand, sat down on a nearby rock, clearly exhausted from the day's trek. Ethan lit the fire, its warmth cutting through the chill in the air. He glanced over at Alia, who was staring into the flames, her face tired but thoughtful. The silence stretched on for a few moments before Alia's mother spoke, her voice low and steady. "I didn't expect to survive this long," she said, her eyes not meeting Ethan's. Her words were unexpected, but they carried weight. Ethan wasn't sure what to say at first, unsure of how to respond to her admission. But he couldn't deny the truth in her words. They had all been living on borrowed time since the crash, and every day had been a fight for survival. Alia's mother continued, her voice softening. "I thought when we lost the others. I thought it was the end. But now, with you here, I don't know what to think anymore." Ethan could hear the vulnerability in her voice, the raw honesty that she had kept hidden for so long. He didn't respond immediately, unsure of what to say. But there was a shift in the air. Something unspoken had changed between them. He sat down by the fire, taking a deep breath, and for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt like part of this small, fragile group. "We'll make it," Ethan said quietly, his voice firm. Alia's mother looked at him then, her gaze searching. "Do you really believe that?" she asked, a hint of doubt still in her voice. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "I have to," he said, his voice steady. The fire crackled between them, its warmth offering a moment of peace in the midst of their uncertain journey. The night grew darker, but the stars above seemed brighter than before. Alia's mother didn't say anything more, but her expression softened, and for the first time, Ethan saw a glimmer of trust in her eyes. They weren't there yet. There was still a long way to go. But for the first time, Ethan felt like they were moving in the right direction. Together. The morning after their brief respite was cold, but the sun's light was a welcome relief. The sky above was clear, the storm now a distant memory. Ethan knew they couldn't linger any longer. Time was running out, and the landscape ahead was unforgiving. The journey they had ahead was uncertain, but they had no choice but to continue moving forward. As the group prepared to leave, Alia's mother gave Ethan a fleeting glance. It wasn't a look of anger, nor one of distrust, but something softer, more resigned. It was as if she had come to accept that he wasn't just an outsider anymore, he was a part of their fragile survival. Alia, though still weary, had grown more confident. The pain from her leg still lingered, but she refused to show weakness. She moved with determination, her pace steady, though she winced occasionally. Ethan kept an eye on her, making sure she wasn't overexerting herself. They needed to conserve their energy for the long road ahead. As the hours passed, the harshness of the landscape began to take its toll on them. The cold wind bit at their skin, and the barren terrain stretched endlessly before them. Every step felt heavier, the weight of their circumstances pressing down on them. But they kept moving. As the day wore on, they reached a plateau, a flat expanse of land that seemed like the perfect place to stop and reassess their situation. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the terrain. Ethan looked around, searching for any sign of shelter, but there was nothing. Just an endless stretch of rocky ground. He knew they couldn't stay out in the open for too long. "We need to find shelter," Ethan said, his voice low. "We can't stay here for the night." Alia's mother nodded, her face unreadable. "We'll keep moving," she replied, her voice steady. Ethan didn't argue. He knew they had to keep pushing. The cold night was approaching quickly, and they couldn't afford to freeze out here. They pressed on, walking in silence as the sky turned darker and the temperature dropped. Alia's mother moved ahead, her pace faster than Ethan expected, as though she were determined to outrun the uncertainty that hung over them. Ethan followed her lead, glancing at Alia every so often to make sure she was keeping up. After what felt like an eternity, they spotted something ahead, a faint outline of a structure in the distance. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small, crumbling building, barely standing against the harsh winds. But it was shelter. They made their way toward it, their movements slow and deliberate. The closer they got, the more Ethan realized just how much they needed this small reprieve from the elements. As they reached the building, they found a broken door, barely hanging on its hinges. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best they were going to get. They stepped inside, the dim light from the setting sun filtering through the cracks in the walls. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them out of the wind for the night. As they settled in, Alia's mother finally spoke. "We'll rest here for the night," she said, her voice softer than it had been in days. Ethan nodded, grateful for the moment of peace. He could feel the tension slowly ebbing away, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. They had made it through another day. And maybe, just maybe, they had found a little bit of hope along the way. The wind howled outside, but inside, for the first time in what felt like forever, they were safe. For now.